Good afternoon, members of the media, wider listening public, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Firstly, I apologize for us being a little late this afternoon. There were some technical difficulties with the live feed that seem to have now been resolved. I am here this afternoon with the Acting Prime Minister, Minister Colin. I am here to address one specific issue and then hand over to the Acting Prime Minister. This government, which came into office in September 2015, within a few days of coming to office, were approached by a group of investors asking us for the provision of an opinion from the Honourable Attorney General for a deal which is now known as the Caribbean Gas Chemical Limited deal, which is CGCL, and is really a deal with the major shareholder being the Mitsubishi Group from Japan, as well as the Massy Group of Trinidad and Tobago and NGC, National Gas Company. When we, as the new government, went to find out what had happened with the Attorney General's opinion, what we discovered gave us a lot of cause for concern. And this is going to be the subject of a ministerial statement when Parliament reopens. But we thought it necessary at this stage to just let the public know what we found and how over the past few months we've been working towards a resolution. When we got to the files at the Attorney General's office, much to our dismay, we found a number of red flagged items by the attorneys who had been looking at this transaction. This is a downstream investment of over 1 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars by the Mitsubishi and Massy Group. And what we found were the technocrats and the government lawyers drawing a number of concerns to the former regime. You all would remember before elections in 2015, the then Prime Minister, Ms. Kamala Persad-Bissessar, turning the sword on a lot of noise and fanfare being made about this transaction, which was to be a large downstream investment. However, when we got to the files for the last precondition, which was the Attorney General's opinion, what we found is that the last regime had put the country and thereby the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago in a very seriously compromising situation. So the Standing Committee on Energy then mandated me, along with a small group of the Standing Committee, to take a look at this transaction and to advise the government, our government, as to whether it should proceed in its form. The simple answer was no. What had been agreed to by the former administration was something that had the potential to expose Trinidad and Tobago to billions of dollars, US dollars, in claims. So immediately we set about having conversations with the government of Japan through their governmental bank called JBIC, as well as the Mitsubishi Group and the Massy Group. And over a period of months, we went through a very difficult phase, but a productive phase of negotiations with the government of Japan and these institutions, that is Massy and Mitsubishi. And I'm pleased to announce today, and the further details will be provided via a ministerial statement, I'm pleased to announce today that after months of negotiations, including a trip where I flew out for 2 days to Japan to negotiate with the government of Japan, that we were able to come up with a mutually acceptable amendment to the agreement that extricated Trinidad and Tobago from these potential billions of dollars in claims. And this week, the high-level officials from the Mitsubishi Group came to Trinidad and Tobago and signed the amended agreements. The Honourable Acting Prime Minister, in his role, substantive role as the Minister of Finance, signed a comfort letter, an amended comfort letter, and I signed as the Acting Attorney General the final document which has concluded the transaction. That is the Attorney General's opinion. So I'm here really to announce today that after months, we have been able to successfully negotiate a deal for Trinidad and Tobago that is a deal that would redound for the benefit of the future generations of Trinidad and Tobago and allow this billion-dollar project to go along. I'm also going to use the opportunity to thank both the Massy Group as well as the Mitsubishi Group, and this is Mitsubishi Corporation as well as Mitsubishi Gas and Chemicals Company, for sitting at the table with us in good faith, even though they had signed and executed an agreement with the former administration and sitting and negotiating with us to come up with a mutually acceptable deal going forward. And lastly, to thank the government of Japan through their lending agency, JBIC Bank, for agreeing to entertain our discussions. And in my trip to Japan over those two-day period months ago, to be able to successfully conclude this deal. It's now been signed. The work has been progressing because we always thought that it would progress in good faith and that we would find a solution. And I'm happy to announce to Trinidad and Tobago that we did manage to find a solution. So we now have a properly negotiated deal with Massy and Mitsubishi NGC in a company called Caribbean Gas Chemicals Limited. That is a full go-ahead, and it is going to bring a level of employment to Trinidad and Tobago, and in particular in the Labrie constituency, and it is not something that is going to expose the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago to billions of dollars in claims. More details, as I say, will be given when Parliament reopens via ministerial statement. We have had the leader of the opposition asking the substantive Prime Minister in Parliament what is going on with this transaction. And I'd like the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to know that what we found when we came in was simply a transaction and a deal that could not proceed in that form because it exposed us to billions of dollars in claims against the National Gas Corporation, and we've managed through months and months of hard negotiations and discussions to now extricate Trinidad and Tobago via NGC from those claims and to find a workable format for this deal to proceed. We will be releasing the footage of these agreements being signed and executed, and we're happy to see this project will now proceed full steam ahead. Thank you all very much.
Well, I am simply here to answer questions. No questions?
This is a good postcard.
Well, Minister, but could you give us any updates as to how the Prime Minister is doing health-wise, and is he still scheduled to return next week as he indicated?
He's scheduled to return next week.
But he is doing well at this point in terms of his health?
The Prime Minister would like all questions relating to his overseas travel to be directed to him.
Okay. Could you, I know Minister Young, last time when you were here, you mentioned FACA legislation. Have you since had any conversation with the opposition about that particular legislation? And perhaps, Minister, you could maybe weigh in as to the importance of the legislation.
But what I did mention on the last occasion is we as a government are ready to proceed full steam ahead, and thankfully the substantive Minister of Finance is here, so he can confirm that he is in a position to execute the intergovernmental agreement. The other part of the obligation is the legislation which is prepared. As Parliament reopens, we shall be laying that legislation, and we expect the opposition to support the legislation because of the importance it has for Trinidad and Tobago as a whole. But that is with the substantive Minister of Finance, so perhaps he can help us.
There are two things that have to be done. An agreement has to be signed between the United States and the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And we have communicated with the U.S. Treasury, which is the counterpart agency involved in this particular matter, that we are ready to sign. And I have asked the Minister of Foreign Affairs to use his good office to see if we can expedite a date for the signing of the agreement, because as you will appreciate, there would be many agreements that the United States would be ready to sign with various sovereign countries around the world, and you have to go into the queue. So I have asked the Minister of Foreign Affairs to speak to the U.S. authorities to see if we can be expedited so that we can sign this agreement as quickly as possible. But we have told them that we are ready to sign the agreement in the form that they have submitted to us. The other part is the legislation, so that it's two steps, but we will be going ahead to sign the agreement and then proceeding with the legislation. The deadline is the 30th of September, but the original deadline was the 30th of September 2015, and I subsequently got an extension from the U.S. authorities of 1 year. I would think that once we sign the agreement, or we've already indicated we're going to sign it. We're ready to sign it. We don't want to make any changes to it. And we laid the legislation in Parliament that we may be able to negotiate another extension, because we would have shown good faith, and we'd have shown that we're serious in proceeding with these two matters. And that should stave off the impending problem that is facing the banking industry in Trinidad and Tobago.
And I can add to that that this is a precedent that has taken place in other jurisdictions where exactly what Minister Imbert has indicated has happened. The signing of the IGA, once the legislation is laid, the U.S. government has provided an extension.
Minister Imbert, Kijan Haynes, TV6. Going back to the Mitsubishi deal, now that it's been signed, can you say, well, what the next steps are? How soon are we going to see progress? And jobs were mentioned for people of Lebre who have been, clamoring for more jobs. What kind of jobs, how many, and how soon can they start getting?
Well, I'll ask Minister Young to give more details, but I'll just explain what has happened. We were unable to finalize the project in its original form. There were certain terms that we considered not in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago, and those have been negotiated, amended, and settled, so they are now in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago. There were two things that were left to be done. Whenever you have projects of this nature that are financed by a foreign bank, they would either want a government guarantee, or they would want what is called a letter of comfort, where the government would give an indication that it would make its best effort to support the project financially, if there's a problem. And then you need to have an opinion from the Attorney General indicating that all of the project agreements are compliant and consistent with the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. Until these two things are done, the financing cannot be released by the bank, where there's an Exim bank. In this case, it's the government of Japan's bank. Well, both documents were signed. I signed the letter of comfort, and the Attorney General signed the opinion indicating that the project agreements are consistent with the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. What had been happening all the time is that the investors, Massy Group, Mitsubishi, National Gas Company, had used their own money to start the project. So they'd have done site preparation and other preliminary work to get the project going. Now that the last two documents have been signed to allow a release of funds, because those would have been the last two conditions precedent to the release of the loan from the government of Japan to the Mitsubishi Massy Group for the project, they can now access those funds and they can really get going in earnest. With respect to the details as to what type of work we're talking about and what is available and so on, I'm not sure Mr. Young has full details, but I'll pass this over to him.
Yes, we are expecting, from what we've been told and the documentation we've seen, at its height, it will be over 1,000 jobs being provided in the construction field. They're going to be hovering around an average of 600 jobs. It dawned on me that an important point that should be drawn to your attention was left out in my initial presentation. One of the things we found when we went back to the records and looking at this deal is that on the 7th of September 2015, which was actually the day of elections, we found an unusual amount of pressure being put on the technocrats at the Ministry of the Attorney General by the politicians to have a sign-off of this AG's opinion on the day of election. Had that happened, it would have put Trinidad and Tobago in the position that I've just described, of potential claims of billions of dollars. So that really is what heightened the urgency and the seriousness of the objections to what was initially agreed to and executed by the former administration. The work is progressing, and we expect, exactly as Minister Imbert has said now, because they can access the funds from the financiers, is going to be proceeding even faster.
And just exactly how much money is the government expected to make once everything is done, construction completed? Are we getting anything out of this?
The answer to that is obviously yes. We'll be getting money, one, from the sale of gas to the plant, but also government is a 20% shareholder in this project. The main output of this project is going to be methanol, so we'll also be getting dividends from that, and of course the benefits that you normally have associated with downstream projects. which are further investment in Trinidad and Tobago, employment, and other types of that nature, which I will get into more when I make the ministerial statement. I can tell you that over the past few months of us negotiating with the Japanese, both the Japanese government as well as the Mitsubishi Group have indicated to us that they now see Trinidad and Tobago as a bigger potential market for further investment by Japan and the Mitsubishi Group.
This signing or pressure to sign on the day of election, is that illegal or just immoral? Any plans to take this to the DPP or anything like that?
I would leave that up to the persons of Trinidad and Tobago to judge when the full details are given.
And the fact is, it wasn't signed. So it wasn't signed. There was pressure on people to sign, but they didn't sign. So it's really water under the bridge.
Minister Imbert, 2 questions. Can you give us an update on your roadshow? Was it successful? And the other question is, how much money did these companies pump into the, I'm talking about Massy and Mitsubishi and NGC. You said they put their own money. How much money did they put?
All right, with respect to the roadshow, we got offers of participation from over 250 international investment firms, including large firms like Goldman Sachs and so on. The bond issue was opened at 8 a.m. on Thursday. I believe that would be about 2 weeks ago. It was on a Thursday. And within 2 hours, we had received offers of $3.5 billion US. So we had set a target with the lead arranger, Deutsche Bank, that as soon as we hit $3 billion, we would close off, because the more that you have to allocate, because we were only raising $1 billion. Even though we got offers of 3.5, we weren't going to borrow 3.5. So you now have to distribute. So it would mean that most people would just get about 1/3 of what they asked for, some less than that. So that we closed off at just after 10 o'clock, having received $3.5 billion in offers. The initial interest rate that was set in the morning was 4.625% or 4.625%. But because of the quality of the offers we got and the volume, we were able to reduce the interest rate down to 4.5%, which was very favorable. And we were then able to allocate the bond to very strong investors, because some investors would be putting in an offer in order to flip it or to resell it immediately, and you don't want that. You want them to keep it, so that based on the advice from the lead arranger, they would have determined which are the best investors to give a higher share. So that allocation process was done within a couple hours, and by the close of business on that day, it was all over. And we had raised $1 billion without any difficulty at all. However, the roadshow itself was very physically demanding and very mentally demanding, because one team went to Los Angeles. I headed that team, together with one of my permanent secretaries, a senior manager at the central bank, the CEO of First Citizens Bank, and so on. We had that particular team went to Los Angeles. Another team headed by my senior permanent secretary went to London and then eventually to Boston. I left Los Angeles and went to New York. To give you an idea of how grueling it was, the first meeting on Monday was at 6 a.m. And we went until 3 p.m. and then we hopped on a plane to go to New York and arrived in New York at 4 a.m. and then started again on the following day, went until 6 p.m. and then started again at 8 a.m. the following day and went to 6 p.m. again. We would have physically sat down and given 1-hour presentations, briefings, and answered questions about the economy, about the exchange rate, about the fiscal measures, about Trinidad and Tobago as being a good investment destination, and so on, 32 times. So it was very, very physically demanding, but I think it was well worth it because we achieved the outcome. With respect to, and it has now put Trinidad and Tobago on the world map in terms of being an investment destination, a solid, strong investment destination. With respect to the money that Massy and Mitsubishi has put in. I'm not entirely certain. I don't know if Mr. Young, you have details on.
I would prefer rather than being misquoted, because I don't have the detailed figures in front of me. All I can say at this stage is, as Mr. Imbert has said, along the way up to this point, the three shareholders, as NGC, Massy and Mitsubishi, would have injected their own cash capital, but now they can access the funding.
Minister Imbert, can you tell us if the state will fund Mr. Daga's funeral?
Well, there are three types of funerals that are recognized by the state. You have a state funeral, that's the highest level, and that is reserved for presidents and prime ministers who die in office. Then you have an official funeral, which is for former prime ministers, former presidents, and sitting ministers of government, actually cabinet ministers who are in office, chief justices, that sort of thing. And then you have funeral with state involvement. Now, Mr. Daga was not in any of the groups that I've mentioned, not being a prime minister, a president, or a government minister. So he does not qualify in accordance with the rules, and these rules have been established for over 30 years. He does not qualify for an official funeral or a state funeral, but we certainly believe that he qualifies for a funeral with state involvement, which is a situation where the state will defray part of the expenses of the funeral. And this morning the cabinet agreed to make a contribution of $100,000 to his funeral. I am also told that the National Carnival Commission has made the Queen's Park, Savannah, the grandstand, available to his family and his organization free of charge for the funeral itself.
Okay. Last question to Minister Young. Is this Chaguaramas Development Authority going against its 1974 plan by putting out an expression of interest for the construction of a hotel at the Chaguaramas tracking station?
The answer is that there are a number of legal arrangements with respect to the Chaguaramas Peninsula that are now currently being reviewed. But as you see, the CDA has gone out with this expression of interest. And that expression of interest will be put into the framework of whatever is the necessary legality. This government will not participate in any illegality.
Good afternoon, Urvashi from CNC3. Minister Imbert, could we stay on the topic of bonds a bit? I'd like to find out what factors were used to determine the price.
The 4.5%? Okay. What the investors would have looked at is our peer group, countries like Oman and so on, that have a similar investment rating as Trinidad and Tobago has, and is also dependent on, and are also dependent on oil and gas, petroleum, for the bulk of their revenue. So in that particular group, we would have been at about 4 5/8%. But because of the level of interest we got, we were able to tighten it to 4.5%. 4.5% is an excellent rate, considering the fact that our revenues have been drastically reduced. That was one of the most difficult questions that we had to deal with. The fact that the price of oil has collapsed down to $40, and that the prospects for the future is that oil may not go beyond $50 for the foreseeable future. So one of the most difficult questions we had to deal with is, what is the government doing about that situation? We were able to persuade the investors that we had a plan, that we have an economic plan, we have a medium-term economic framework, we have a fiscal plan, we have a plan to balance the budget, and on that basis we were able to tighten the rate to 4.5%.
How would you respond to some analysts who said because the bonds were oversubscribed, you could have dropped the interest rate further?
Yes, that's easy to say. You have to be there. Because what happens is that when the investors put in their offer, they give you a range. They would tell you they will put in $100 million, for example, at 4.75%. If the rate goes down to 4.625%, they will drop their offer to $50 million. If the rate goes down to 4.5%, they'll drop it to $20 million. And if you go below 4.5%, it drops to zero. And it's very, very complicated. You have to be actually involved in one of these road shows to understand. It's all very fluid and very dynamic. So the investors are telling you a range. They say they will invest money if you stay within this range. So the bulk of the investors told us that once we stay at 4.5%, their offers remain solid. But if we go below 4.5%, we run a very serious risk of, say, 75% of the offers falling off the table, and then the bond issue would have failed. So that is why you hire a lead arranger, because a lot of discussions take place after the meetings. You have your face-to-face with the investors. Then they will tell you what their offer is. And then immediately after that, Deutsche Bank will get on the phone or even have side meetings with these investors and talk to them about how low would they be prepared to go and at what point would they lose interest and not invest in the bond. And it was clear that 4.5% was what is called a cliff. If you fast that, you drop off the cliff and the bond would have gone to zero, the bond would have failed, and Trinidad and Tobago would have been laughing stock. So under no circumstances was I going to allow that to happen. And in any event, our target was 4.5% before we even left Trinidad and Tobago. So we were very, very happy that when we reduced from 4.625% down to 4.5, the majority of the 3.5 billion held. But we were told emphatically, if we go below that, you'll get one or two people willing to come in at 4.4%, but the bulk of investors will just leave. Okay?
Minister, there's also some concern raised over how much of the US bond was available to local investors.
Now, the point of the US dollar bond is to raise Trinidad and Tobago's profile internationally. You want to maintain and regain confidence among international investors, because this affects our rating with Moody's and Standard & Poor's and the IMF and so on. Our international ratings, credit ratings, are based on a combination of things, but they're primarily influenced by how the outside world sees us. So this was an international bond. We decided to allow local investors to participate. That's really a decision that we made. We didn't have to. We could have gone with purely international investors. So we made available 115 million US out of the billion to locals. There's obviously an appetite among local investors for US dollar denominated loans. So what we're going to look at in the coming years, because I'm happy to say that the overdraft is now zero. The government's overdraft is now zero, down from $9 billion, but it won't stay there for much, for very long, because we have expenses all the time. But we don't want to go and borrow willy-nilly. One of the questions posed to me, for example, was, having received offers of $3.5 billion, should we upsize the bond to $1.52 billion? And we had a long discussion with all of the technocrats present, the civil servants, myself. We discussed it. And I was persuaded by the technocrats that we should stick at $1 billion. We will be looking to the local market in the future to make a US dollar denominated issue, because it's clear that there's appetite in it. Because there are very few, you have to understand the way it's made up. There are very few opportunities for local banks and local institutions to participate in foreign US dollar denominated bond issues. So we will be creating one for local investors in the future.
And on this issue, I'm glad you spoke about the appetite for the US bonds by local investors.
Yes.
How could you attest to the disparity in the same appetite as to the TT bond, the TT $1 billion Republic Bank Rate bond?
There's also a tremendous appetite for the TT dollar bond. I mean, for example, when we floated the $1 billion bond, that was almost oversubscribed by 2 to 1. When we went out with the RFP for the $2 billion bond, we got numerous proposals in terms of satisfying that $2 billion bond. There's also tremendous appetite in the local market for TT dollar issues, because you have to understand there isn't much outside there for investors. What are you going to get from anybody else? From any other opportunity that a local investor would have available to them, there isn't much there. The government is the only one that's outside there offering bonds, and it's a safe bet as well. So it's a very attractive proposition for locals, and there is appetite for TT dollar denominated bonds as well, both TT and US.
I just have a few more questions, if you don't mind. On and
Sure.
what are the
If you want
utilities?
to. No, you go ahead.
Sorry, on the downstream gas. Right.
Not with Massy Group or Mitsubishi. What were the concerns flagged and what are the new terms now?
That will come in the ministerial statement.
Okay, last week there was a man claiming to be from Trinidad, Al Trinidadi, who claimed he was featured in a magazine, says he's a terrorist fighting with ISIS, and he claimed to have carried out acts of jihad in TNT. Is that of concern to the government, and how are you responding to this?
None of that has been substantiated. So we would like to cross our T's and dot our I's and not talk out of turn. The fact that that might have appeared in a publication does not mean it's true. And we don't want to speculate. We don't want to speak out of turn. We prefer not to comment on that matter until all of the issues surrounding that and other similar matters are authenticated. Somebody can say anything, you know.
Understood, but is it something that the government is looking into? Are you investigating it?
We look into all such things, but we go through a very rigorous process of due diligence to determine whether these things are just idle statements or whether there's any truth in it, and that matter has not been authenticated.
Thank you. And final question on the GATE. We're told our government is going after those who defaulted on the GATE program. What is the cost attached to that? Like, how much money do you expect to get back from these students? One, and two, is there fear that you're saying it's only those who attempt to re-enter the education system will be penalized?
Could you identify the source of your statement?
Gosh, I read it in the newspaper this morning.
You read it in the newspaper. The newspaper is the source?
Yes, yes.
Well, I am not aware that she's a member of the cabinet. Cabinet makes policy for Trinidad and Tobago. I'll have to look into that and see whether that is backed up by official government policy, because the cabinet took decisions with respect to GATE. I'm not sure whether that is a carryover from a policy from the past to try and go after defaulters. I have no idea. But I would ask you just to deal with the official policy announced by the Minister of Education.
What I had said at the post-cab last week, Thursday, with respect to that, is when we looked at the contractual terms and conditions of the GATE contract, there are provisions whereby the persons who access GATE are supposed to complete certain terms and conditions, and those who didn't, we will be pursuing them going forward. Like you, we saw what has been said, and exactly as Minister Imbert has said, the cabinet position is that the terms and conditions of the GATE contract will be policed and they will be upheld as best as it can be possible, and that is the cabinet's position.
Let me just bring some clarity on that. My understanding of the contract is that having received a certain amount of funding, the person is obligated to work in Trinidad and Tobago for a period of time. So depending on whether you got 50,000 or 100,000 or 500,000 as the case may be, you're obligated to work for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and so on. So, and you're also obligated, of course, to complete your studies and pass your degree. So that if there are persons who dropped out, for example, or left the country, did not complete their period of obligatory service, then they would be in breach of contract. So all the AG would have said or is saying is that we'll be looking into breaches of contract. With respect to the statements in the papers, I'm not sure the origin, and I would advise you just stick with what the cabinet has said for the time being.
That doesn't mean that you don't have an idea of just how much you could probably rake in.
No, we have no idea. We have absolutely no idea. What happened in the past, as far as we are concerned, is that it was a bit lax. You know, the enforcement of the contracts was not as rigorous as it should be, so that we are currently looking into all the persons who would have signed a contract to receive GATE funding and would have agreed to their obligations, which is to complete the degree, pass the degree, and work, and see. Some of them may be subject to limitation. You don't know. I mean, a contract is, you have 4 years to pursue somebody if they breach a contract. These things may be going back more than 4 years. It's not a simple thing. There's an intent to enforce the contracts, but to quantify how many people you're talking about, how much money you're talking about. I don't think it's appropriate at this point in time for anybody to speculate on the numbers and the figures and so on.
But who's going to be doing the enforcing? Are we hiring somebody new? Because clearly the people who were supposed to be doing it before didn't do it properly. So what sort of methods are we doing now to really start to track down these people and get that money back?
I think you've answered your own question. Obviously, we'll have to have new people to do this.
And that was also part of the cabinet announcement that we will be providing additional resources to the
Obviously.
body charged with these
If it didn't work
responsibilities.
before with the existing people who had that responsibility, obviously we have to get new people to do it. No, I think you're going way into an
The realm of
adventure there. That
speculation.
I don't think you should go down that road.
We'll take
Okay.
a couple more questions.
Yeah, it may
Thanks.
very well be that the unit was not properly staffed. It may very well be you needed 50 people or 100 people to do this, and you had 2 people. These are things that we are looking into right now. I wouldn't go that way at all about firing anybody or anything like that. I would suspect it's a resource problem. That the unit, with respect, I'll give you an example, like the unit that will have to look at the means test. There's currently a unit in the Ministry of Education that would have been inherited from the Ministry of Tertiary Education. And that unit has just a couple people in it because they were only required to deal with applicants for financial aid, small number of persons. Now with the means test, obviously that unit will have to be beefed up. You'll have to have many more people inside of it. There may not have been focus, the required focus on recovering money from defaulters in the past. So the unit may have been very small. We will give it the proper resources and deal with it, okay? We're not going backwards, we're going forwards.
Minister, but as
Yes.
we speak, the OWTU is outside demanding outstanding arrears for
Yes.
state agencies.
Yes.
Are you all going to meet him? And
I will assign the Minister of Labour to speak to them to get the details.
Can we afford it?
I beg your pardon?
This deal that was signed is the period for 2011 to 2014. They're asking for outstanding
Would you kindly be more specific? What deal are you referring to?
The union's outstanding wage negotiations, they were settled for the period.
They were settled?
2011
Are you
to
sure about that?
2014.
Are you sure?
That's the understanding that I have, or there was some sort of agreement that they wanted settled at least.
I would suspect that you would need to get your facts straight.
Well, let's I will confirm that, but the negotiation period is between 2011 and 2014. What are you going to tell them, or what are you going to instruct the Minister of Labour to tell them at this time?
I think we first need to find out what is going on.
Minister, but I just wanted to get a little clarification on something you said earlier about the overdraft being zero now. Does that mean that we now have access to the funds in the Green Fund and the IDF?
It's not as simple as it appears. The way the government system works is that you have a appropriation every year, a parliamentary appropriation. So you can only spend what you appropriate, so that each ministry would have an allocation, and they can only spend up to the maximum of that allocation. My understanding is that approximately $100 million, and I'm subject to correction, was allocated for expenditure from the Green Fund in 2016. And it would mean, yes, that the appropriation that was made for the Green Fund is available for disbursement. But we only have 6 weeks left in the financial year, you know. So you can also only spend up to September 30th, and then you have to reboot and start all over again. And there will be another appropriation for the Green Fund in 2017, starting from October 1st.
Just one other thing I wanted to touch on, and that's expanding on the issues with Petrotrin. While you were away
With Petrotrin?
No, with the OWTU and their various concerns, sorry. But also, while you were away on the roadshow, you had the contractors still asking for back pay issues.
Contractors asking for back pay?
Yeah.
Back pay?
Back pay.
Not back
Back pay?
Their outstanding payments, sorry. That $2 billion figure that they continue to bandy about, and postal workers also with some payment.
Postal workers?
Postal workers.
You're mixing up the two things, you
they're
know.
two separate groups
Yeah.
of people, Minister, who have concerns regarding payment. So could you indicate as to how those matters are being handled?
I signed some warrants yesterday that would send some funds to the various state enterprises to start dealing with outstanding bills from contractors. That's one of the things you can do when your overdraft is zero. But as soon as you do that, your overdraft goes up. So the overdraft is now, we have now 95% of the overdraft available to us, where previously we had none. I got it down to 100, so that 100% of the overdraft was available. I've now spent 5% of the overdraft, $450 million. So I made some funds available for, agencies like NIDCO, etc., to start UDICOT, etc., to make payments to contractors, so that some relief will come. As to whether we can pay that entire $2 billion, I doubt it. Within the next month, I doubt it. But I've started to release funds and payments will be made.
And that $2 billion is
I have no idea where that $2 billion figure comes from. What I've done is I've asked each agency, I've asked education facilities, I've asked the Ministry of Works, I've asked the Housing Development Corporation, because these are the big spenders, to tell us what is the total of all their outstanding, they call them aged payables, they're the outstanding bills, which then have to be validated, authenticated for payment. So that, as I said, I signed some warrants yesterday. If my memory serves me correctly, it would have been close to $300 million of bills that would have gone through the process of authentication and validation and so on.
Right, I'm going to just get the record straight now with the facts as you requested. So the OWTU is what wants to know when the negotiations for TNTech, NP, UE, UTT, and Petrotrin for the period 2011 to 2014 will be settled.
Are you speaking on behalf of the OWTU?
I'm rereading my tweets from earlier when I was...
All right. I will send the Minister of Labour, as I said, to speak to the Oilfield Workers Trade Union to get detailed particulars as to what the issues are. When we get them, we'll take it from there.
I'd like to thank you all as usual for your patience and for your questions. And until next post-cabinet, thank you all very much. Much appreciated.
Okay.